Hello, everyone. I'm Mabel Chan. Welcome to my podcast, One in a Billion, part 4 of our special series, Find Your Roots. Find Your Roots is about Asian American mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, looking back at the roots of their family history, cultural identity, and personal journey, one person at a time.
My name is Francis E. Chin, Chin Goitiang.
Francis Chin was born in 1947. He's part of the boomer generation.
I grew up in Charlestown, Massachusetts, and that is very distant from the roots of my culture, Chinese and China.
Fran's parents grew up in Toisan, Guangdong province in southern China. His father came to America in 1918 as the son of a government official. But after weeks of detention and interrogation on Angel Island,
my father ended up in Charlestown working in my uncle's Chinese hand laundry. My mother told us how the United States is called Gimsan. That means Golden Mountain.
In today's episode, Fran remembers his parents' daring escape from extreme poverty in China during the early 20th century. They held fast to the American dream for a better life in the land of the brave. And Fran himself, a retired corporate immigration lawyer, is now holding his Chinese roots tighter at this stage in his life as a way to become whole. Here's our conversation. Hello, Fran. Welcome to One in a Billion.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Fran, you were a corporate immigration lawyer in Boston for decades before you retired.
Yes. When I was at NYU School of Law, I thought I should know something about immigration law because I expected my relatives and others would come to me for help. I was absolutely right about that.
Good for you. When did you retire?
In 2013.
Why is that?
Well, I had practiced immigration law for over 30 years. Two things impelled my decision to retire. First, I had younger partners, and I thought that it was time to give them the chance to run the practice. I had started an immigration law firm, was very fortunate, built it up to a firm of 12 lawyers and about 40 people altogether. We were the largest business immigration law practice in all of New England, and we had a national practice. The other is that I was still healthy. My wife wanted to spend more time with me. I don't think she regrets that thought at this point.
That's funny. Fran, was there a legal or immigration background in your family?
I'm the first lawyer in the family. My parents were immigrants to the United States. That's how my siblings and I were lucky enough to grow up in the United States.
Well, I want to ask you now about your parents' journey coming to America. Tell me about that. When did they come and how?
My father came to the United States in 1918, and there's a very interesting story about his arrival here. The Chinese Exclusion Act was in effect from 1882, and immigration to the United States of Chinese nationals was very limited. One of the ways that a Chinese man could come here was as the son of a government official. My grandfather, an ex officio advisor to the Chinese consulate in the United States. Hence, my father was able to come in as the son of a government official.
That's a very esteemed category.
Well, nevertheless, my father was stopped and spent weeks at Angel Island. That was in 1918. He was questioned. As I understand the story, even though there were some inconsistencies, he was still admitted to the United States. So from that lofty story, my father ended up in Charlestown working in my uncle's Chinese hand laundry. My mother came to the United States, married my father in an arranged marriage. She had never met my father before she came to the United States. In the village, she married my father in a proxy marriage in which a rooster stood in for him.
Oh, wow. I have to cut in and just express my surprise. I would only hear and read about this sort of stand-in marriage as like a myth, but it actually happened?
It actually happened, indeed. And she stayed at the home of my father's parents until she was able to get her visa and to immigrate to the United States to join my father.
So now, going back to the first question about how your parents came, why did your father want to come to begin with in 1918?
Well, there were economic reasons. Both my parents grew up in villages. They both came here to escape penury.
What did they hear about America?
My mother told us the United States is called Gimsan. That means Golden Mountain. So the talk in the villages that one could come to the United States and make one's fortune. This, of course, was very appealing with the poverty-ridden existence that people lived in the villages in China.
Your father came without a word of English.
That's right. He was a quick learner. He went to the Loco elementary school, even though he was an older teenager at that point.
Where is that?
So he went to the Harvard School in Charlestown. He entered in the 4th grade. He was diligent. He was apparently quite good at learning English. And 3 years later, he graduated from the 8th grade. And that was the height of his education. But it enabled him to get by quite well with English.
And you mentioned he started working in a hand laundry.
That's right. Back in those days, there were no machines.
What year would that have been?
1918, 1920. So there was no such thing as a washing machine and dryer. And this was a carryover, actually, from the gold rush days. The Chinese were brought over during the building of the Transcontinental Railroad after the gold rush in order to work on building the railroad from the west to the east. They had the extremely difficult job of carving a path through the mountains. This was dangerous, arduous work. The Chinese were considered to be extremely good workers, so the railroad company brought more and more Chinese over to do that.
But your father never was part of that, was he?
He was not part of that. However, what happened after the railroad was built was that those Chinese who were not driven out by the white people who were facing unemployment were relegated to washing dirty clothes. My parents operated a Chinese hand laundry because it was one of those few occupations that were open to Chinese in those days.
Fran's mother came to the U.S. in 1932, 14 years after his father first came. Also in 1932, without warning, the Japanese attacked the city of Shanghai for weeks. Tens of thousands died, and hundreds of thousands of others were displaced as refugees in the fighting area. Fran's mother was not in Shanghai at the time, but hundreds of miles away in southern China. And she was lucky enough, after years of waiting, to get the visa to go to America. But she had to travel over a month before arriving in Massachusetts.
She was able to come here as the fiancée of my father. There was quite a bit of research done by my family about this. It took a good number of months for her to get her visa. She traveled from her village to Hong Kong, and in Hong Kong, she boarded the Empress of Russia ship and sailed to Vancouver.
For how many days?
Over a month.
Wow.
She took the train across Canada to the East Coast, to Boston. She was held for a number of weeks in South Boston, the equivalent of Angel Island or Ellis Island, and interrogated about her eligibility to enter.
I'm just stunned and in awe of how your mother, in this case, and many others, I'm sure, back in those days were able to drum up the courage, right, to take this journey, which is so long and arduous. But at the core is the ability to produce some evidence of some relative, like a husband or fiancé in Massachusetts. I mean, did she write some paperwork in Chinese and presented it to the authorities in the United States?
It was extremely complicated, and this was engineered by my father's oldest brother, my uncle Abak. This was quite an elaborate arrangement. This took quite a good deal of
Lawyering.
not lawyers, but ordinary people.
Now I see that is probably the seed of your passion to help people like your parents who were immigrants seeking better opportunities and better lives in America, is to enable that process.
I consider my career of having practiced immigration law to have been exceedingly fortunate. I believe that immigration to the U.S. is win-win, very good for the individuals. They're changing their lives. Immigrants are special people. It takes tremendous courage to pull yourself away from all that's familiar. Even if you're living in difficult economic circumstances, you're leaving your family and all that is familiar to you. You're going someplace where you're not only not familiar with, but you're aware that you may not be fully welcome. So it takes tremendous courage and fortitude. My mother had that in abundance. She was an extraordinary person.
You mentioned you did not start as an immigration lawyer. You started with corporates and banking. So how did you get into immigration and why?
I had always thought of immigration law as being, and I mean this in the most respectful way, statute of liberty immigration, the reuniting of families, and so forth. But I learned from this professor that there was this aspect of immigration law called corporate immigration law. His firm was one of the leading immigration law firms in the country, and he represented major companies.
Like
Shell, Mobil, major consulting firms. These all were companies that needed assistance. And I said, wow, this is interesting to me. So I took a second course in immigration law. When I came to Boston to work for the law firm I was at, I was working in the corporate department. The senior partner, who was my mentor and boss, knew that I had learned about immigration law. And one day he came to me and said, Francis, I have an immigration case. Would you like to work on it? Well, I was the most junior associate at the firm at the time, and I said, yes, sir, I'd love to.
And since then, there's no going back.
That's right. So I had some trepidation. This was a new circumstance for me, just a month or two into my practice there. I knew that my law firm and its lawyers were welcoming to me, but I didn't know how a client would react to me.
Why is that?
Well, because it's evident to everybody that I'm Chinese American from just looking at me. And I was very aware that people make assumptions.
Who are these clients?
This was a corporate client, one of the firm's important clients.
How did you overcome that initial pause and looking at you, making you feel as if you're not up to the job?
I didn't feel that I wasn't up to the job. I was concerned in the back of my mind that the client might say to the senior partner, I'd like somebody else to work on this.
So he's more imagined than real.
That's correct, yes. I think as soon as I opened my mouth, I helped dispel any doubt there might have been through my professionalism, my knowledge of the law, my analysis, my clear understanding of the corporate ethics that came to bear, and I would say my ability to put the client at ease.
That's fantastic. I do want to pick up the story about your parents. Can you describe what were some of their initial struggles, if you have any pictures in your mind or any visual memories I just want you to tell some stories about what it was like for them back in the 1920s and how did they survive?
They worked incredibly hard. The stories I've heard make it clear that life was difficult. When there wasn't enough business, my father would take a wagon and he would go down to the naval yard, which was in Charlestown at that time. He would go to the ships and convince sailors to give him their dirty laundry to clean, and he would return it. That was in the 1930s and the 40s. It was smack into the Depression. This was a challenge because I'm one of 9 siblings, a growing family, where there were 11 of us, 9 children, and my father and mother. My father was a gregarious person, and customers would come, he'd chat with them, they liked him.
So how did he even get business? I mean, he has no shop. He has no business loan to open a hand laundry.
That's right. He worked at my uncle's, and then they scrimped, saved, and they eventually moved across the street, diagonally across the street, and opened their own laundry.
Wow. They were able to get a bank loan or something?
No such thing as a bank loan available to Chinese at that time.
Wow. In the 30s, 40s.
Right. It was a mortgage and scrimping and saving and paying that off over many, many years. The laundry was downstairs. The 11 of us lived in 4 rooms above.
What do you remember watching how you're raised, and in what ways are you shaped by the way you were brought up?
I actually have no knowledge of my father directly. 3 months after my younger brother was born, when I was 15 months old, my father died. My mother raised all of us.
9 kids.
9 kids. Age 3 months to the oldest was 15.
How did she do it?
It's extraordinary. She was a superwoman.
What did she do?
She ran the laundry. All of the children who were old enough worked in the laundry.
And everyone saw Mommy was working hard.
My mother worked 6 days a week from 7:30 in the morning down to the laundry till 9 at night.
Who cooks?
She cooked.
What?
Yeah. And delicious meals.
Wow, I cannot
Extraordinary.
imagine. I cannot imagine. Are you in touch with all your siblings still to this day?
Oh, we get together several times a year.
How are you affected? How are you shaped by watching your mother working so hard, hand laundry business, to you becoming a lawyer?
My mother believed in education, and she believed that this was the means towards moving beyond our social circumstances. And she was right. She pushed us always to do better and to excel.
And you listened, you didn't rebel.
Well, we weren't happy because not only doing our homework, but we also had to go to Chinese school. So Chinese school was 5 days a week from 5 to 7 p.m. We went every day after regular school and then for 3 hours on Saturday.
Did you ask your mom to go to an English school? Did you have that idea way back then?
No, we didn't. My mom was working all the time.
And you saw that, how hard she worked. It's impossible to ask more of her.
Right. She set the example of hard work. All of us, as we grew up, had to work in the laundry. I so was affected by this that I said, I will never own my own business because of how much work it takes. So what did I do? I opened my own law firm after 8 years as a partner at my prior law firm out of law school.
Did she give you the idea to study law? I want to know the seed of that interest in law.
No, she didn't. Asian parents, and particularly Chinese parents, stereotypically push their children towards professions, doctors, engineers. Lawyers are not really in that category, and I think for 2 reasons. One, there's not really a tradition of law as we know it in China. So my parents certainly didn't grow up believing that law had a central purpose in society. The second thing is that the practice of law typically requires some good facility with the English language. And sometimes even second-generation immigrants don't gain the fullest facility with English, depending upon their education.
So where did the idea come from for you?
It's actually a funny story. When I was traveling around the world on a Watson Foundation fellowship, I met a couple of fellas in Hong Kong who became friends. They were in Hong Kong as part of the Yale in China program. They were not in China because China was not open.
What year was that again?
Well, this was in 1972. President Nixon had just had his rapprochement with China. And some people were getting into China. So they were in Hong Kong. I stayed with them, and I talked with them and learned that one of the fellows had gone to Columbia Law School. And I thought, well, this should be something I could explore.
You like the way he talked about the study of law, I bet, right? He sounds excited about it.
Yes, yes.
But what did you study in college and where?
I went to Middlebury College in Vermont. And this was back in the days when you still studied what you liked instead of what could become part of your living. So I studied German language and literature.
Whoa, where did that come from? Why German language and literature?
I read in freshman year as part of my language requirement one of Hermann Hesse's books. I liked it, and I said, I want to be able to read more German literature in the original language. Literature of each country, of each language, contains much of the cultural essence of a people.
Your mom clearly was not a tiger mom and said, you're wasting your time.
The words you just stated were words I heard from her, too. What are you going to do with this?
I see.
But by that time, I was becoming myself. I said, I'm committed to doing this.
You were able to have a conversation with her, not just taking orders, and she was not being so authoritarian. You were given latitude.
I was given some latitude.
How did she raise you in ways that become who you are in terms of character and choices in life?
My mother taught us to be humble. This was very much a Chinese cultural trait. And my mother very much believed in that, to be humble and not put yourself forward.
And what does that look like, humble?
Well, that means while you strive to excel, you don't call attention to yourself. Don't try to become the leader. Be number two.
Being supportive.
Right.
Being in the background. Put your head down. Do the work.
Indeed. It was only later in my professional life that I learned and adopted a stance that was more forthcoming, one in which I was less embarrassed to say, oh, yes, I won this award, or I like being listed in the best lawyers in the world, so forth. I co-founded an organization called the American Business Immigration Lawyers. We styled ourselves as being among the best business immigration lawyers in the country.
And how did that come about? Was it forced out of you by circumstances? You saw that you were neglected, overlooked, or were you coached by your mentor to be that way in order to assert your rightful place?
I was fortunate. I hit upon and became friends with very supportive people in the occupation, in the profession of law, and in particular in immigration law. They said, you belong here.
I wanted to switch gear a little bit. When I first approached you to have you join this conversation about Find Your Roots, what comes to mind for you?
What comes to mind is that discovery of one's roots is important to becoming integrated as a person.
And what does that mean?
Unless you know your roots, which is a part of who you are, you can't become a whole person. One's roots and history are part of who we are. Just like we're part of the stars, particles from billions of years ago are part of who we are. Our immediate history is part of who we are, perhaps not genetically, but perhaps epigenetically. It's there.
Tell me more.
I'm very fortunate in that a few of my older siblings have been very active in the research, going to the National Archives in Waltham, travel back to China to the villages and talking to relatives. I regrettably was unable to do. Unfortunately, my mother-in-law became extremely ill at that time. I made the difficult decision to stay to help support my wife at a time that was very difficult for her.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, thank you.
What did they find on that trip that you were most surprised or delighted to find out?
My mother going to my father's village, seeing the room and the bed that she stayed in while she waited for her visa to come through. There were photographs at the family altar, photographs of my family from when we were youngsters. To see this connection over the many years was quite astounding.
You hit on a word that I would really like to drill down before we run out of time. This word, epigenetics. I am curious what comes to mind when you say that word in the context of tracing who we are. What makes us who we are physically, mentally, emotionally? What comes to mind when you say that?
Well, there's an undoubted transmission of cultural identity, of values, of character that gets transmitted from one generation to the next. And this happens very often, being around a person and seeing how they act.
The movements, the hands, the eyes.
People say your son is clearly your son because of the way he arches his eyebrows, the pauses in his speech. I tell my wife it's also his braininess, but she assures me that comes from her.
At this stage in your life, how do you see your Chinese roots coming out, or more your American roots coming out? How do you see them showing up?
I'm more conscious of trying to celebrate my Chinese roots. We still annually or twice a year go to the cemetery for Tomb Sweeping Day, and we perform the traditional rites at the graves of my mother and father. We bring food for their spirits to enjoy.
Is that Buddhist practice or?
It's more ancestor recognition.
Paying your respect.
Right. We burn incense, we burn paper money, we burn sheets of paper flecked with gold or silver so that they have the money to live well in their next life.
And that is a belief that you inherited from your mother?
Yes. We would all go with my mother to my father's grave to do this, and we continue to do that. All my siblings join in, and spouses.
Every year.
Every year. Then we recognize and try to assist those less fortunate than us who are Chinese or Asians by working with nonprofit boards. One of my brothers is on the board of the Guangdong Chinese School, where we went to Chinese school. One brother he's the treasurer of the Asian American Civic Association. I have a sister who was a founder and is on the board of the South Cove Manor Nursing Home. A sister who is on the board of the Asian Community Fund. I support the Asian Task Force Against Domestic Violence and other Asian organizations. To honor our mother and father, we do the same for an Asian graduating senior from high school who has shown that they've had grit. They've had to work through some difficult circumstances.
Just like your mom did.
Right.
You mentioned this project that your siblings have started, piecing the roots, right, of your parents. What's next with it?
We engaged Ken Eng, who is a talented young filmmaker, to take the material and create a video. So with documentation, it's long, but the hope is that this will then be available to our descendants, future generations, to see a history that begins with my mother and my father.
Thank you so much for your time and sharing so much of yourself.
Well, thank you, Mabel. This has been a lot of fun, and I appreciate it.
I was born in the little town of Sorsogon, Philippines. I live in New York ever since I met Mr. Lewis, and we got married. I was the one who proposed marriage to Mr. Lewis.
That's Mrs. Loida Lewis, author of Why Should Guys Have All the Fun? An Asian American story of love, marriage, faith, and running a billion-dollar business empire built by her late husband, Reginald Lewis, in the 1980s. Tune in to that episode on the last Tuesday of September. We will take a break in August. Finally, I'd like to share a new podcast that I'm enjoying. It's called Two Lives. The host is Laurel Morales. She was an award-winning NPR reporter. The title comes from the quote, "We all have two lives. The second begins the moment we realize we have only one." Two Lives is a bi-weekly show about someone who faced darkness and how that moment transformed them. It's based on real-life character, well-crafted and produced. It's been featured on Apple Podcasts as a show we love and listed among Spotify's best episodes of 2021. One in a Billion Find Your Roots special series is made possible in part by a generous grant from the Phi Lambda Charitable Trust. We also rely on listeners like you to sustain our production. Please consider supporting our work with a donation. To donate, just go to our website at www.oneinaBillionVoices.org. Click Donate. Your donation is tax-deductible. One in a Billion is produced by our sound engineer and designer Brian Latwinowicz, and our lovely theme song is composed by Brad McCarthy.